Hey, I've had a few friends ask me how I make silver rings and things. I'm going to do a full walkthrough tutorial on how I do it from beginning to end, so here we go.
So starting off, I get my Delft clay and I pour it into my mold. I think it's called the flask mold or flask something. I don't remember. I'll put a link for the stuff in the description if I remember, in case you're interested. I think these are like 20 bucks on Amazon, 20, 30 bucks, something around there. So you take your Delft clay. I don't like to touch it, but anyway, this is 130 mesh, in case you're wondering. That's how small the particle size is. And that just basically means that it's very fine, and so it gets decent detail when you're trying to make a copy or a mold of a ring. And so this is the material that the mold is going to be in, and this is refractory, so that means I can pour very high temperature liquefied metal onto this and it won't deform or change its shape. So anyway, you'll want to pour it in first. This is the side that you're going to want to pour in first, the side that doesn't have prongs sticking up, and then I'll show you what to do after that. Let me just double check. I like to make sure my holes are clear. Sometimes if I'm sloppy, I'll get a bunch of Delft clay in the holes. So I try to keep a little piece of wire nearby, and I have a 40-gallon tote that I just kind of keep all my junk in here next to me, all my stuff that I use for this process. And then I just make sure these holes are clear. These need to be clear because when I put the two halves together, I want to make sure that the two slides slide together all the way. And I've done this before where they weren't clear and I wasn't paying attention and it didn't completely slide together, and it kind of messed up my mold a little bit, as you can imagine. It's I basically had like a, I don't know, 1 millimeter gap, and so I had a lot of silver to trim off of. It was kind of annoying. So try to make sure that that's relatively good, but not perfect. Put that over here off to the side, and then you take the clay. I like to do this over a tray. I used to use cardboard, but then I realized there's this cookie tray that no one ever uses. So hopefully my wife doesn't get too mad at me, but I've never seen anyone use it, so I figured it'd probably be fine. And then you just kind of work it in there. And you can probably guess how those holes get filled up, just from me being sloppy. The main idea here is you want it to get to a certain level of rigidity, and then also you want to get all the air bubbles out so that when you're casting your sample you don't have a bunch of flaws. There we go. Just to make sure that there's no issues here. A little bit more. I would say you probably want it to be able to withstand about 10-15 pounds of pressure. It doesn't have to be too hard, but you don't want it too soft either. And you kind of get the feel for what works well when you have a few failures and successes. But basically just working it back and forth like this kind of like works it into the air bubbles. Probably put a little more right there, but it doesn't really matter because all my entire cast is going to be in this section right here. And you'll notice that I'm trying to avoid touching the stuff with my hands. I just hate the way it feels when it gets stuck to your fingers. It's kind of difficult to get off. But again, it's not really that big of a deal. You could also just put gloves on. Just recycle whatever it doesn't get put in the mold. And I kind of work it around a little bit as well. The stuff that I pour back in here, especially after I recast it, it's a little bit packed. I kind of work it around. And then I also try to put some what's the fluid called? brain went blank. Transmission fluid. I like to mix a little bit of transmission fluid. As you start using this and you start pouring really hot silver, you'll get some of the material that it kind of burns off a little bit, and there's some kind of a oily solvent in here that kind of allows it all to cake together. That burns off and it basically turns back into like this fine powder, and so you can reconstitute it with some oils, and I found that transmission fluid seems to work really well. So that's what I use for reconstituting my Delft clay. Sprinkler's turned on, not a big deal. All right, so next step I take my mold. This is some of the silver that I'm going to be using, so 99.9% silver, and I have a felled mold. I tried doing a little kitty cat ring here, and it just had a bunch of flaws and things like that. And then I tried, I was messing around with it, trying to stretch and make it look funny, just for fun, since I was gonna remelt it anyway. And this is my sprue from a recent project. And I'll probably superheat this and then dip it in water just to get all this impurity and corrosion out. It works really well. You superheat it until it's glowing, dip it in water, and then all that stuff just dissolves and comes right off in the water. Here's my 3D printed model. I 3D printed this the other day. This one's gonna be for a friend. He wanted to make a surprise for his wife, and so I just asked him the dimensions of what he wanted. So I just 3D printed a 4mm size 6 ring, and that's what this is. Really easy to design on my computer. And then what I do is I take wax and I kind of rub it into all the little cracks, just to fill in those impurities, and also to make it not stick to the Delft clay, because if I don't put wax on it and I stick it in there, it's just going to stick to the clay, and then when I try to pull it out, it just creates a huge mess. So I'm going to push that in the clay here in a minute. Put the silver back in here so I don't lose it. And you can get silver for pretty cheap. I mean, you go to the local pawn shop / coin shop, and you can get silver like this. Usually it's the price of silver plus $3 or $4. They call it spot price. So you just look online, whatever it says online silver costs. Like right now, I think it's like $24 an ounce. So basically you can buy these things for $24 each. And that's enough silver to probably make about 4 rings, depending on how big they are. Like smaller rings like this ring, this is like 7 grams. So one of these could make like 4, 3.5 rings like this. Or if you have a big fat ring like this one, this ring's 20 grams, so that's 2/3 of one of these. So if this is $24 worth of silver, this is 2/3 of 24, and this is 9/31, because there's 31 grams in an ounce. So whatever that comes out to, roughly 1/3 or 1/4 of $24. So I don't know. All right, it's usually not a good idea to have anything on your fingers while you're forging, and so I usually take them off and stick them in my pocket, just in case. I mean, with the refractory gloves on, it shouldn't matter. But it's probably good practice to not do anything too invasive, too hard-working on your hands when there's rings on your hands. And then right before I do this, I like to take a little bit of wax and just make sure all of my imperfections are filled. Any imperfections will just be magnified when you cast something. So I got the wax on there, and then I take the ring, and I dip it in the powder. And this is a powdered ceramic, like I said, called titanium dioxide. A lot of people use it for homemade sunscreens. You can also use it as a paint pigment. You mix this with linseed oil, which is the base for a lot of paints, oil paints, and it'll make an extremely reflective white paint. The sunscreen that you see people stereotypically putting on their noses that looks funny, that's usually this type of sunscreen. It has a lot of this in it. It's also very good for ceramics, high temperature metals. The reason I like this stuff so much is when you embed it into the Delft clay and it leaves that cavity behind, that cavity will be coated with this, and this will exclude the silver to give you a much smoother finish when the silver enters the cavity created by the mold, the negative that's created. can picture that. So anyway, push that in there just a little tiny bit. And then you're gonna take a little bit more of this. This is just supposed to act as a non-stick material. You can also use, some people use baby powder. This is so that when I add the top half, the bottom half doesn't stick to the top half, and I'm able to pull it apart without damaging my mold too much. Shoot. The dog's playing with the birds. Stuff like this you want to make sure you do outside as well. That's why there's some distractions with noises outside. I don't recommend doing this in a enclosed area. Although it'd probably be more convenient to do in my garage. It's just not as safe. And you want to double check it, make sure it's closed all the way. And then you fill up the backside. And this is kind of overkill for something this small, but you can obviously scale this up. Like the rings that fit my fingers are much bigger. And then this is obviously a woman's ring, or it could, I guess it could go on someone's pinky. But this is a size 6 mold, so you can imagine it's probably smaller. Most of the rings I usually do are like size, like this is a size 14. That's for my, that was for my pointer finger. Got big sausage fingers. And then I usually put a little additional pressure around where my actual ring is, or whatever it is I'm trying to mold, just to make sure it's filled in all the way. Especially with something this small, you're going to want a lot of details. And this will usually work like 90% of the time. Sometimes you just got to redo it. It's not a big deal since you're just using this reusable clay. Try to take the stuff off. Shake the stuff in the corner, put the extra back in the bag. Alright, we can now open it up, see how it worked, see if it failed or not. Cool, looks like it worked just fine. And you'll notice there's a lot of imperfections around there, but the point is we have 2 halves to a hole. And I'll show you how to clean this up and get the ring out. I usually like to use plier, tweezers, whatever those copper things are called that I have down here. Save those. I have a whole bunch of these that I've made. Alright, and then you're going to want to make a little channel for the sprue. And you don't want the sprue to be too big. It's just annoying to try to off when it's too big. It's just hard to balance when you have a ring this small. These are a little bit more difficult. Hopefully that's coming across in focus. is a dangerous thing to do, especially when you have fingers that are shaking like mine are. I just like to make sure that there's no imperfections in the mold. All right, looks pretty good. That side looks all right as well. I always try to take it apart and put it back together just to make sure no crumbles or fragments of clay fall into the impression. And you can kind of see here there's a little funnel shape that I made. Actually, I might make that a little bit better. Because what's going to happen is I'm going to pour liquefied silver into here. And I want to make sure the silver goes where I want it to go. And so you kind of have to make a little funnel here. And normally I have a chopstick that I use for making my funnel shape. There you are. Shoot. Well, that's not good. I might have messed this up. I got a little bit overly aggressive with my chopstick. We'll see what happens. Normally I would just redo this, but I think I'm gonna be okay. We'll find out after we pour in the silver. Let's just try it. So what I'm doing right now is I'm looking through here, trying to make sure that there's no imperfections that are loose, like loose chunks of clay that are gonna get bumped by a little stream of liquefied silver. Because what'll happen, it'll be like an avalanche, and those little chunks of Delft clay, if they get in the path of the liquefied silver, they'll get pushed down into the mold, and they'll end up creating a negative impression in the molten silver. So for example, if one of those chunks gets pushed down into the bottom end of the ring shape, it'll end up just putting a big dent in the future ring. Start my melting. This is borax flux. So I took some of that boric acid and I mixed it with water. Very concentrated. It's going to put a nice skin oxidative protective layer on this. So I'm just going to prevent the amount of oxides that I get. And also help it flow a little smoother.
See?
Did you do it vertical?
No.
Nice. All right, that's a good sign. And yeah, I poured way too much silver, but that's okay. This is obviously really hot. Now I just have to separate it. Instead of sawing all this extra off, I like to integrate it into the ring. And this also hardens the silver. I don't have an anvil, so I use the back side to kind of make sure it's nice and even. And then I'll sand it all up and polish it. Take off a little material right here. And of course reheat it. Cool. Love you. And I like to use a leather strump to get the nice shiny finish. So some imperfections, but I think it turned out pretty well.